Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual program. My name is Devin Malone, and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Today's program, A Conversation on the Black Presence in Tudor England, presents a research-based exploration of Black Tudors in England during the 16th century. This program coincides with the exhibition, The Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England, currently on view at the Legion of Honor. To share more about today's speakers, Dr. Miranda Kaufmann is the author of Black Tudors, The Untold Story, shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize and Naif Al-Radan Prize. She read history at Christ Church, Oxford, and is now an honorary fellow of the University of Liverpool, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Royal Society of Arts, and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, School of Advanced Study, the University of London. She is currently working on her second book, Heiresses, and is taking her work into schools with her Teaching Black Tudors project and the world with her Black Tudors, The Untold Story Future Learn course. Michael I. Ohajuru is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies with honors degrees in physics and art history. Ohajuru writes and speaks regularly on the Black presence in Renaissance Europe. He is founder of the Image of the Black in London Galleries, project director and chief evangelist of the John Blanke Project, an art and archive project celebrating John Blanke, the Black trumpeter to courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII. A co-convener of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies What's Happening in Black British History workshops, and a founding member of the Black Presence and British Portraiture Network. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, Devon, and hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be invited here today to talk to you about the Black presence in Tudor England. I wish we were in San Francisco, but this is the next best thing. So I think until quite recently, most people didn't know that there were any Africans living in Tudor England, but I'm here tonight to tell you otherwise. And actually, recent scholarship has disproved that completely, and we now have evidence of at least 200 people living in England and Scotland in the Tudor period, which ran from 1485 to 1603. And as you can see, just from looking at the chapter titles of my book, they were really doing a very wide range of different things. We'll hear a lot more about John Blanke, the trumpeter, who is the cover image for my book, or inspired it, from Michael in just a little while. But as you can see, we have salvage divers, silk weavers, a visiting prince, some sailors, my research showed that these individuals were not actually enslaved at this time. There's evidence of them being paid wages, like John Blanke, and also testifying in court, like Edward Swarthy, and also they also were baptized and married, sometimes married English people, as I will talk about a little bit later as well. And so, but the exhibition that's on in San Francisco at the moment is very much inhabits the kind of courtly world of the royals and their courtiers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, first I was going to tell you about how Africans were not just in that London courtly context. About a third of the Africans that we know of were in London, but there were also concentrations in southern port towns like Southampton, Plymouth, and Bristol, which makes sense if you think about where the ships they would have travelled to England on were coming from. And but they're not just in big cities or port towns. You can see some of these dots. These dots don't represent every single record, but they're a beginning of an indication. And you can see that they are all dotted around the place, from as far north as Edinburgh to as far south as Cornwall. And here's an example from a tiny village north of Cambridge, where Dido, an African woman, was buried in 1594. But as I said, at the exhibition, we're living in the Tudor Court, like John Blanke, who, again, as I mentioned, Michael will tell us a lot more about at the moment. But my point is that there was a Black presence at the Tudor Court from the earliest years of the 16th century, because we know that John Blanke played the trumpet in the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII. And we think that he came to London via Plymouth in the entourage of Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who came to England to marry Prince Arthur, who was Henry VIII's older brother, who died shortly afterwards. And in much the same way, these medals are in the exhibition. In much the same way, when Philip II came to England to marry Queen Mary, who was Henry VIII's older daughter, we know from a very fleeting reference that there was an African in his entourage. We have this fascinating diary entry from a London cloth merchant called Henry Machen, which talks about a fight that broke out on the streets of London at Charing Cross one November day, and because there was some, the English weren't very happy to have these Spaniards in London, and there was a bit of a fray here, and it says that there was actually a blackamoor, which was one of the terms used to describe Africans at this time, one of the instigators of this quarrel, and he gets brought before the authorities. So we know he was there, but we have that fleeting black presence, and in the same way, we have this very fleeting reference to another blackamoor at the court of Elizabeth I, and we know that he was there because she bought him this particularly ornate outfit to wear, which, as you can see, the modern artist Joe Lillington has tried to recreate in this image. It's white. It's white taffeta with gold, silver, lace. It's very, very ornate, but we know next to nothing else about him. But that there is this black presence throughout the royal household throughout the period. And it isn't just the royal household. There are also Africans present in the households of several aristocrats and gentlemen who would have frequented Elizabeth's court, particularly here, as you can see. But for the rest of this presentation, I just want to delve deeper into one of the stories that there's a hint of on this slide, which we know the most about. If you look closely at the portrait of Francis Drake, you will see that he's wearing quite an ornate jewel around his waist, and this is known as the Drake jewel. And when you open it up, you see an image of Elizabeth I, and you'll see in the exhibition there are a couple of jewels a little like this with images of the Queen on them, and this was given as a gift to Francis Drake by Queen Elizabeth I. But I'm much more interested in the image on the outside, as you can see. And there's been some debate about what that image means, but I'm with those who interpret it as a symbol of an alliance between the English and the Africans. And this dates back to a particular story on a raid that Francis Drake made to the Caribbean in 1572. So in 1572, Francis Drake set out to annoy the Spanish, and he attacked a port called Nombre de Dios in Panama. On one of these slides, you can see a drawing of the town. At the time, it was pretty small, but it had a big significance because it was where the Spanish shipped their silver from every year. So it was a good place to attack, but he got there at the wrong time. But what he did do is meet an African called Diego, who was enslaved in the town, but ran to join Drake's ships when they arrived. And Diego proposed that the English form an alliance with the Maroons, the Cimarrones they were called. And this is a wonderful portrait of some Maroons from Ecuador a little bit later on. But it's the same principle, that these were Africans who'd been enslaved by the Spaniards in South America, but had then run away, sought their freedom, and created new settlements in the hinterland, in the mountains. And the ones in Panama had been raiding the Spanish settlements and silver train for several decades by the time Drake showed up. But Diego led the English to the Maroons and brought them together, and together they decided to attack the Spanish. So as I was saying, the Spanish were mining treasure in South America, in Peru, Ecuador, but there wasn't a Panama Canal at this point. So once a year, they would ship that treasure up to Panama and land at Panama City on the south coast, but then they would march it across where that red line is up to Nombre de Dios, where it would meet the fleet coming from Spain, which would then ship it back to Spain. And after quite a few mishaps, they did successfully capture over 150,000 pesos of gold and silver from the Spanish. It was very much a Cimarron raid with the English tagging along, but Drake did manage to bring a large amount of that treasure back to London, but he wouldn't have been able to do it without Diego. And it was on this adventure as well that the Maroons showed Drake, and Diego would have been with him, a point where he could look out over the Pacific. And that was, as far as I know, the first time an Englishman had seen the Pacific Ocean. And so when they got back, Drake presented a lot of treasure to the Queen, and she would have done this sort of thing with it. This medal is also in the exhibition. And so she was delighted, and he had made his first fortune. Diego had also come back with Drake, and he spent the next 4 years living in Plymouth, which you can see is a port city on the south coast of England in Devon, which was a really kind of booming port for Atlantic voyaging at this time. As you know, it was the port that the Mayflower set sail from in 1620. And I've got a picture there of the Minerva pub, which is on Loo Street, which is where Drake's house was at the time. And that building does date back to this period. So that's the street that Diego was living in. And he wasn't the only African in Tudor Plymouth. There are several other records, but he's certainly the one we know most about, although we know very little about his time in Plymouth. He might have accompanied Drake to Ireland at this time as well. There was, but what we do know is that 4 years later, in 1577, he was part of Drake's crew when he set out on this voyage that was to become the first time that an Englishman sailed all the way around the world, as you can see reflected in Drake's crest, his coat of arms that he was granted after the success of the voyage. And this image is actually not of the original ship, which no longer survives, but it's a replica that it actually was built, I think, for the 400th anniversary of the voyage. Anyway, so you can see their route here. We don't hear much about Diego until he reaches Mocha Island off the coast of Chile, which you can see there. And the English annoy the inhabitants of the island, and they attack them with arrows and drove them off the island. And Diego actually had 20 arrow wounds by one account, but he manages to survive, even though the ship's doctor was dead by this point, and there was only a boy who had been his apprentice on board. And as Drake's Golden Hind goes up that west coast of South America, he raids all these Spanish settlements. And because it's the first time an Englishman has crossed the Straits of Magellan, the Magellan Straits, these settlements are completely unfortified. So he's very successful. He captures lots of treasure, and he also captures a few Africans along the way. Some of them he then leaves behind in different ports. And we don't know the names of the several men, but we do know the name of a woman, Maria, who he captured from a ship in April 1579. And so by the time they leave Huatulco in Mexico, there's Diego aboard, there's Maria, and there's two unnamed African men. And that means that by the time they get to what is marked on this map as Nova Albion, and what you might know by another name, we have on board in the summer of 1579, when Drake's ship stops in California. There is still, as you know, probably some debate about the exact location, but you have those memories on the landscape of Drake's Bay, Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, that memory and the National Historical Landmark to acknowledge the significance of this location. But what this means is that when Drake landed there and interacted with the Miwok people and claimed the land for Queen Elizabeth, all of that was witnessed by 4 African people, one of whom had spent time living in Tudor England. And so I believe that those were the first Africans to set foot in California, certainly with an English person, and that I think that's really significant and interesting in the context of it's 40 years before 1619, which is often when African American history is dated from. Unfortunately, none of those 4 people made it back to England with Drake. Diego eventually died of his arrow wounds in the Moluccas near modern-day Indonesia. And it's not clear to me exactly how he managed that. He survived for a whole year, but we think that maybe one of the wounds turned gangrenous and got him that way. And unfortunately, Maria, who was by that time heavily pregnant, we don't know who the father was, but it was unlikely to be Drake because he may well have been infertile because he never had any children with either of 2 wives. But Maria and the 2 African men were abandoned on an island, also in Indonesia, that was known as Crab Island. And it's not clear whether they were left there because they thought she might not survive the voyage home with a young baby, or whether they were abandoned. But that's another story. But that's how the Black Tudors linked to California, and I hope it's provided some interesting context for viewing the exhibition. And you can read more about it. Oh, I put my hand on the slide. There it is. You can read more about it in chapter 3 of my book. And I'm now really looking forward to hearing what Michael has to say about John Blanke the trumpeter. And I'll join you again for conversation, Michael, after we hear all about that.
Thank you for that, Miranda. Okay, can you just stop sharing your screen? That'd be great. Yeah. Thank you. That's great. Okay, let me share my screen now if I can find it. This technology works. Just one moment. Let's share your screen. There it is. Share my slide. I'm good to go. Okay, great. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about John Blanke and showing you the John Blanke Project. And John Blanke Project is my passion. John Blanke, as Miranda's indicated, is the trumpeter to Henry VII, Henry VIII. And what makes him truly exceptional is we've got both a record and an image. And it's that image that really gives him the celebrity status, makes him the poster boy of the Black Tudors, and inspires my imagine the Black Tudor. So we want to find out more about him from his image and his brief mentions in the court record. Because here we have him being paid wages. You can see there to John Blanke, the Black Trumpet. He's paid wages, and when you go further into the statement, it says the Black Trumpet, his month's wages of November past, he's paid 8d. That's 8 old pence. Turns out to be 20 shillings or £1. That's about 2 or 3 times a labourer, but a fairly good wage when you think he was all found. When he was in court, his food, his lodging was all paid for. But we did that when he travelled with the court, then he had to pay. But certainly when he was in court, he was looked after. So he was quite relatively well positioned. Now, this is how we know him. We know him from this document here. This is the Westminster Tournament roll in the College of Arms in London. This is a document dating from 1511. It's a 60-foot long document, about 16 inches deep, and it records a joust held by Henry VIII to celebrate the birth of his son on New Year's Day, 1511. And John Blanke appears twice on the robe on the roll. He appears in the opening. He doesn't appear in the joust. I'll talk about it in a moment. But he also appears at the closing ceremony. So he appears 2 images twice in the opening and closing ceremony, and he has a part in the joust. And here we have him at the opening ceremony. He's leading the parade of the gentlemen of Henry's court, and you can see he's a troop of 6 trumpeters, and there he's at the back. And then we move on to the next scene. This is the central scene. It happened over 2 days in February. This is the joust itself, and trumpets would have been key parts of the joust, announcing when the joust is finished, or starting rather, or when the joust ends. It was the kind of the punctuation of the joust, and you can guess who won the joust in terms of if you know Henry VIII is. He's such a man who was full of himself. But here we have the end of the closing ceremony, and John Blanke leading the ceremony, leading the leader of the joust, and it was Henry into the arena before the attendant crowds. So there we have those two images of John Blanke. And what makes John Blanke special? As I say, we have the images, then we have those fleeting records of him, and it makes him almost, in some ways, a man of mystery. And that's where my project comes in. We have to the glib expression is we have to fill in the blanks to try and understand a bit more about him. Like, for instance, let's understand the importance of that image, because we're talking at a time where portraiture was just starting. At this time, this is the early 16th century, the late 15th century. People were known, or nobles, elites, were known not by their image, but they were known by their coat of arms. And here we have a royal procession into the House of Lords. These are all these earls, the great and good of the land. They all look the same, but they're differentiated by their coat of arms. So when we see this image of John Blanke, it really is special for its time, because ordinary people, working class people, were never portrayed. But the portraiture was for the elites, for the kings, the princes, the queens, the leaders of the church. Very important people. But here, John Blanke, a working man. So that's what makes this image truly. Then when you backfill with those fleeting references in the court, he was paid wages, so we know he wasn't a slave. He petitioned for a wage increase. He was given cloth for various ceremonies. So we got some teasing little bits about his existence. But and when we put those portraits together, we can then build up an image of him. When we look at that name, for instance, the name is really intriguing, because he's not the only John Blanke. Because there's a 14th century John Blanke who was given, or Johann Blanke, Blanke being the French for white. He was given by the King of Aragon to the Spanish king as an enslaved African, was given as a gift. The African called John Blanke. And then in Venice, the Juan Bianco, that's the Juan, that the Italian for John, and Bianco, the Italian for white. He was a commander who was a mercenary for Venice. And then there was a 16th century thief in Granada who stole some silk handkerchiefs. And he was called Johann Blanco. Blanco, the Spanish for white, and John Blanke. And it goes on in the Spanish play in the mid-17th century. Johann Alba is a black soldier in a play. But for me, the most intriguing is this character here. This is 15th century England, John Black. Now, John Blanke is spelled, his name is spelled variously, with the E, without the E, and then John Black, a Blake. So this must be a derivative of John Blanke. And I guess it's a play on the fact that he's white, he's black, and you're saying John White. They're having making some fun or giving him a nickname. What's really intriguing about this John Black? He was a footman to Henry VII, 1488. And then we've got the John Blanke, the 1511 John Blanke, the trumpeter. Now, right now, there's a lot of discussion or debate. Could they be the same person? It would have to be a very young footman and turn into a very old trumpeter. So that image of John Blanke doesn't look too old. So I hold on to John Blanke, the trumpeter, but we don't know. They could be one and the same person. Could that name John Blanke, or equally, they could be different as those John Blankes across Europe. So the name is just underlines the fact that we know a little, but not enough, and he remains in some ways a man of mystery through his name. And then when you look at if you look at the troop he's with, the six trumpeters, he's the only one wearing some headgear, and it's not just any headgear. It's a turban, and turbans are traditionally associated with Muslim or the Islamic faith. And this is a Christian country. So how come he's allowed to wear an Islamic symbol? When you think the gentlemen of the court who were in the procession, they all had various colored hats of different materials, often with plumes on. And if you look at the king had a very prestigious red. Red was a sumptuary color that only the king was allowed to wear. This red hat made in red velvet, very precious or expensive cloth, and it's festooned with flowers and jewels. So the headgear was all about status. But here we have our man John Blanke with his with this turban. So many historians, and myself included, see there's a way of Henry, or the court recognizing that he was a special person, that he was special, and he could be allowed to be himself because he brought something special to the court in terms of his skills as a musician. Now, I've given you a teaser for some of the things we know and don't know about John Blanke. As I say, we've got those 2 images and some brief mentions in the court record. And that's where the John Blanke Project comes in, where we try to imagine the Black Tudor trumpeter. And this is where I've commissioned about 30 historians to imagine John Blanke from the brief record that we have of him. And there's something like 60, 62, 63 artists to look at that image and kind of recreate him, to have more images of him, so that we can have different ways into understanding John Blanke. I'll share with you some of the interpretations the historians have had put on John Blanke. Like Professor Olivetti talks about him as an Afro-European, whereas Robin Walker talks about a black man with a trumpet changing perceptions. Where Temio de Mose talks about a question, yes, but a satisfying mystery. You know, and Phil Day, he did a rap about John Blanke, and so he talks about the internationalism of John Blanke's presence in the Tudor Court. Whereas Professor Hakimadi talks about him aging for change, getting us to rethink our history, or the history of the Black presence in Britain. And Jan Marsh talks about an invaluable Tudor portrait, as I've kind of indicated to you. And then when we look at the artists such as Matthew Collins, I took a very modernist view of him, or we've got John Daniel, who saw him as the trump card, or Stephen Boy Watley kind of reinvented that image in a modern, stylized way, the image from the 15th century, and he made it contemporary. Or Alvin Kofi, he had him as a learned man. Or Lynette Kamala, she had she called this graffiti. It's a version of graffiti. She had John Blanke in various interpretations of his name and what he stood for. Or we have Sharon Foster, who saw him as her son, a dignified black man. And I say there's about 62 artists reimagine John Blanke. So if you want to know more about the John Blanke Project and John Blanke, check out johnblanke.com. So you get a full understanding of what the historians thought of him or considered him, and equally you can have a sense of how the artist imagined John Blanke. Okay, so having looked at the images of John Blanke and his presence, I want to turn now to some, with Miranda, go have a look at some of the pieces on display in the exhibition. So Miranda, if you come back and join us, that'd be great.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi,
Michael. It says I can't start my video because the host has. Oh, right, okay. Start my video. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Great. And what we're going to do now, Miranda, we're going to have an informal discussion about some of the pieces. I'm going to kick off by looking at two of the portraits, and these are 2 special portraits for me because they show Henry VII. This is 1501, 1509. It's close to the end of his reign, and then we have the young Henry. On the right, the young Henry VIII. He's like 19, 20 years of age. He's just been made king. So John Blanke would have played at the funeral of Henry VII and at the coronation of Henry VIII, and he's given cloth for both, so it's recorded. But there you can see both these paintings are in the exhibition, and you can see how they are very special in terms of they're celebrating a passing of the baton from one generation to another. And Henry and John Blanke played a key role in not negotiating, but presenting at, as I said, the funeral of one and at the coronation of the other, and showing we have that portrait of him, so we know that we understand his importance to the court, both in terms of the portrait, but the fact that he was part of it. Now, I know it was Miranda originally introduced me to John Blanke, because she's got all those, you've got lots of Black Tudors there, with some have got bigger backstories than John Blanke, but John Blanke's the only one we have an image, and that makes him so special. When you consider this as a time when images were really special, the Tudor court was just coming alive in terms of being made pictorially real, and you look at the images of Henry VIII that come from it, Queen Elizabeth, these images you'll see in the exhibition. You can see the power, the prestige, the magnificence of the court. And John Blanke, I like to think, is part of that. Do you see the same sense around he's part of the portraiture at the early stages of portraiture in English history? John Blanke's there.
Yeah, well, it's amazing, isn't it? And as you say, you know, he's not only the first Black Tudor we have a portrait of, the first Black person we have a portrait of, but he's like the first working man that we have a picture of, because everyone in the exhibition are, you know, really upper class, aren't they? But it is really special having this image, because, you know, a picture speaks 1,000 words. And while we have many, many individuals, he's the only one we can kind of put a face to the name.
And what we're going to do now, we're going to show you some implicit Black presences, because often the Black presence in the exhibition is hidden, has to be teased out. I want to share this view, your piece, Miranda. You had these images from the Bible. Perhaps you want to tell us a little bit more about them. Right.
Well, I mean, looking at these images, you wouldn't see any Black presence at all. Although, of course, there are African figures in the Bible, and that's quite interesting to look at those when we think about ideas about Africa that everyday Christians in England might have had. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, one of the main sources we have for the Black presence in Tudor England are parish records. So we have evidence of Africans being baptized, married, and buried. There's over 60 baptisms that we know of, and quite a few of them were adult baptisms. So that's quite interesting as well, because to be baptized in the Protestant faith required, they wanted to proof that you understood what you were doing. You had to have learnt the articles of the faith. You had to participate in a ceremony that was at this point quite improvised. You know, there was no entry in the Book of Common Prayer explaining how to baptize an adult, but there was this sort of improvised ceremony that we have some records of, and I think perhaps what people find particularly striking is the evidence of marriages between. There were marriages between two Africans, but there were also a few marriages between African men and English women, and in at least one case, an African woman and an English man. There was a woman called Joan Maria who married an Englishman called Thomas Smith in Bristol in around 1603. And he was a weapons producer. He made bills, which are the sort of long spikes on sticks. And the next slide, Michael, shows us a little bit about how that might have been thought of at the time, because the two Bibles in the exhibition are the Coverdale Bible and the Great Bible. And in Numbers 12:1, there's this really interesting phrase about Moses, who had an African wife. And you can see in the Coverdale Bible, she's described as a Mauryan, and in the Great Bible, 1540, it was she's of Ind, and Ind has kind of got a very kind of broad definition at the time. And actually, in a slightly later version of the Bible that became very popular, she's described as an Ethiop. So as you can see in this Dutch painting from 100 years later, that's very much how she was envisaged. So I think that's quite interesting, especially in the context of American history, where interracial marriage was illegal until pretty recently. And I think there are, that one of the other people in my book, Mary Phyllis, we have her baptism record when she was 20, which shows that she's learnt the articles of the faith and everything. But the question is, well, why is she getting married age 20? Why is she getting baptized? And one of the reasons she might have been baptized is in order to allow her to be married, because you couldn't be married in the Church of England unless you were a baptized Christian. And so she could have been getting married. And there are other baptism records where there's actually a marriage record within a few weeks. So they've literally been baptized, and 3 or 4 weeks later, they're married in the same church. So that's pretty interesting. What have we got next, Michael?
We got the gift rolls. There's these 2 gift rolls. Again, they're in the exhibition here. They're from Elizabeth I, and they're 30 years apart. And the gift roll, this was the list of gifts that the Queen gave out at New Year's. And this is all about magnificence, statecraft, nobility. giving out to the people. This is her being Machiavellian in terms of maintaining her position in her realm. So she gifted people, and you can see if you look at the bottom there, the earlier one was 92 inches in the starter reign. It grew to 130 inches, almost a 50% increase, reflecting the amount of giving that she had to do. How many people she literally had to bless and look after and make sure that let them know that she appreciated them. So gift giving was a key part of kingsmanship and queenmanship, statecraft, giving the appropriate gift to the right person. And it wasn't just for the elites. You had to look after your court. And Henry VIII was no different. He looked after his people. And there's a record of a gift, an instruction from John Blanke, an instruction to the Great Wardrobe to deliver to John Black. And you can see whether it's black here, and we believe that's John Blanke. And he talks about our trumpeter, so it must be John Blanke, the same person. Say a gown of violets, including the bonnet and the hat, to be taken as a gift against his marriage. This was a marriage gift. So what's really exciting about that statement here? We've actually just recently found this document here. This is essentially the bill from the people of the tailors, the seamstresses, the weavers, the people who actually made that document, that gown, and we actually got an image of it here. Because before we came on, we were talking about how the Tudor drama or reenacting Tudor is a big business now. So there's a number of companies who actually are recreating these documents, because we have the record here. Well, what makes this document really so special? This is for John Blanke, a black trumpeter. He's given a gown, and it's quite an expensive gown. And when having discussed with the people who actually know about these things, so he was well thought of. That he was given such a prestigious garment on his wedding. So it just underlines the fact, and we go back to wearing that bonnet. Not the bonnet. Wearing the turban. He was treated a little bit special, a little bit different. Now, Miranda, I know you're going to say Henry gave gifts to everybody, because it was quite normal. But I always see this. It was a little bit special, this gift, compared to other gifts. Am I right in that, Miranda?
It's definitely really special to see this document, because you've told me about it, but this was found after my book was published. I've never actually physically seen this detailed description of the bill, the tailor's bill for the gift, because the record I'd found was very frustratingly brief, and I just think it's amazing how the Tudor tailor people are able to produce that detailed drawing from that hard to read black and white
exactly. And
it's just fantastic. And I think it's quite interesting because it's such an early Tudor costume, because I think when we think of the Tudors, we think of doublet and hose, we think of big ruffs and things, and this is still quite medieval, isn't it? We're 1514, so it's 1512, so it's really quite special, this, and I hope that we see a real live reenactor in this costume in Greenwich soon.
What's really special for me about this, okay, it's John Blanke. I'm a big John Blanke fan, as you know, but it's purple. And purple is a color that looks good on black people. It's a color that if you look at Joe, Oswald Boateng, the tailor in London, he makes that's his signature color in many of his suits. So this is a 21st century color going back to the 16th century. So it really is an exciting document for me. By the way, if you check out johnblanke.com, we've translated that into English, if that's the right word. So you can actually read what the actual instructions and the price of each piece of material and the cost of constructing it. So if you want that, that's online at johnblanke.com. Okay, I'm getting the post the advert in there, but why not? Why not?
Right. So was there another image on this slide, Michael, or is it just him? Is he it's going to appear. Anyway, so this may be the man this may be the man you've been waiting for, our cover image for the event. Although I'd argue he's not really representative of the black presence in Tudor England at all, because he was a visitor He stayed for about, 6 months. He was from North Africa, Morocco, whereas the majority of the Africans we found are from West Africa and lived and were permanent residents or even born in England. So he is nonetheless a fascinating character. What were you going to say, Michael?
No, what I find fascinating about him, because this is the Reformation's complete now. Henry VIII cut himself off from the rest of Europe, Catholic Europe. So this is Elizabeth trying to reach out to my enemy's enemy. This is Moroccans against this Islam against Catholic Spain. So he's trying to make connections. So I love that sense of, like, that Henry VIII did that big joust. He was trying to reach back into Europe, trying to celebrate. Look at me, I'm the big man with my big court here, celebrating who he was. So this is continuing that tradition of Britain trying to big itself up and trying to make connections. And I think I almost see it like it's almost like Brexit in reverse now. They're trying to make friends. Henry was trying to make friends in Europe, and now they've lost that connection with Europe now through the Reformation. They've cut off their ties with Rome, and now they're trying to make new ties with Islam. And I don't think they worked, did they? They tried, but it wasn't too successful.
If you look at this map, which is also in the exhibition as well as the portrait, I think it explains quite clearly that the situation, well, it's a bit complicated by having Elizabeth on it, but it shows the situation, because I think a lot of the time when we hear about Elizabeth I's foreign policy, it's a very Eurocentric narrative. It's England versus Spain, the conflict in the Netherlands. But if you look at this, you can see all along the left-hand side of that image, you've got Africa, and the only place in Africa you've got marked is Barbaria, which is one of the names they have for Morocco. And Morocco was actually the only North African country that remained independent of the Ottoman Empire in this period. And Elizabeth I also sends envoys and has ambassadors with the Ottomans, but that's another story. But if you look at where England is and Spain is, Morocco is on the other side. And the Moroccans had their own beef with Spain, and so it could have been my enemy's enemy is my friend. And there were several. This ambassador was not actually the first Moroccan ambassador to come to England at all. So can you go to the next slide, Michael? Yeah, so it all goes back to the Battle of Alcazar, and one of the reasons, which was in Morocco and was fought between an uncle, a nephew, and a brother. The three people vying for the. No, it was uncle and his nephew, and the third. It was also known as the Battle of the Three Kings, because there was the reigning king of Morocco, his uncle Sultan al-Mansur, that you can see here, and the young Sebastian of Portugal. And it was actually this battle that tipped the balance of power in Europe and in the world, because Sebastian of Portugal had got involved with this fight and then was killed, leaving no heir, leaving Philip II of Spain to take over the Portuguese throne and the Portuguese Empire, which made him an even more formidable enemy to Elizabeth I. And this is the Sultan al-Mansur that the Moroccan ambassador was the ambassador from. And he became Sultan after this battle. And al-Mansur actually means the victorious. So this was the battle where he then reigned exactly as long. He died in the same year as Elizabeth I, 1603. So he was the person they were trying to ally with, and he was interested also in conquering Spain. But unfortunately, his strategic objectives and Elizabeth's were so disparate that it didn't really work out. And it's actually interesting looking at the story from the Moroccan perspective, because before the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English in 1588, the Moroccans didn't really, disregard it. England was just some little island off the coast of Europe. It wasn't very important. But once the Spanish Armada was defeated in 1588, probably mostly by the English weather rather than its sea captains, the Moroccan ambassador, the first Moroccan ambassador from Morocco to England, is actually 1589, the year after the Armada was defeated. But I think we need to move on, don't we, Michael, to our final.
Well, this is an enigma. It was given to us, and we're asked to comment on him. And it's a piece from Broughton Palace, Palace in Kent. Sir Edward Wotton, he was a treasure to Calais when Britain owned a bit of France. And it's got this figure on which looks, it does look African. These are two other pieces for context. And it was introduced given to us as perhaps England looking to Renaissance and the classics. And this is some kind of God. Miranda, I'm always challenged here because I can see the classical connection, but I can't think of any black nymph with those ears, So I find it a troubling piece, an enticing piece. I love that word. The word I like to apply is problematic, meaning I don't quite understand it, although it has got obviously means something. Did you have any view on it?
Well, I think it definitely poses more questions than it answers. I think that we need to go back to the image of the black in Western art studies, and there's a photographic collection of all the images of black people in Western art that could be found in Harvard and another one in London, and they have a whole set of folders of sort of blackamoor heads like this, and I think that it would need to be someone's whole PhD. It need to be studied in context with other blackamoor heads, but those gills are quite
exactly. That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary.
I think the most value it has for me now is to just make people think, what did the Tudors think of Africans? What did they know of Africans? Were there any Africans in Tudor England?
If you look at these, the one probably perhaps the most famous Moor's head here is Sir John Hawkins, the trader who was given his coat of arms by Elizabeth I, and there he has a Moor as his crest on his coat of arms, and we can clearly get that link between enslavement and the crest of arms, so we know what that's about. Or there's an interesting one here, the Juxton. William Juxton was Archbishop of Canterbury. You can see there's this pilum for signifying the Archbishop of Canterbury, but it's got 4 Moor's heads. We believe that relates to the family's connections with slavery. And this is an archbishop in the very early days of English slavery. But
in the same building that you have the Westminster Tournament roll, the College of Arms in London, there are books and books recording every single grant of arms going all the way back to the beginning. And I've just flicked through those once, and there were quite a lot of blackamoor heads, certainly, in families that going way before enslavement, and like families that had no known connection. And there's a lot of stuff about, there's a blurring between blackamoor heads and Saracens' heads, and is it a Saracen that was decapitated in the Crusades, or there's all somebody needs to do a whole PhD. What else have you got for us?
Sir Thomas Son's could exactly fall into that category you talk about there. The Saracens, it's a Moor's head. We don't really know. We need more research. One that we do know that is quite fascinating. This is Sir Thomas More. This is the tombstone for his wife, and you can see on the left we've got his symbol. He was the moor hen, but we've got a Moor's head, and this is a play on words here. We believe Moor's head, and this is quite common. There's I've seen examples from Germany where they've got the Mohren, and he has a Moor's head. That's his symbol. Nothing to do with enslavement or the Crusades, but you're play on words. So when you come back to our piece here, you can see it doesn't fit. Those pieces of examples are all from England, almost contemporary with it. It doesn't quite fit. So we need to do more research to try on that piece. But in some ways, I think this is what sums up looking at the black presence in Tudor England. It's tantalizing. It's there. You have to look hard, and a lot of interpretation has to be done. So I'd like to finish there from my side. And if you want to say a few words, Miranda, before we go to questions.
No, I think you said, as you said it all, but there's a lot more to find out, and hopefully this has piqued your interest, and we're going to look at some questions now, aren't we?
Okay, I'm going to stop my share. Okay, there you go. And we're open for questions.
So there's a couple that have come up in the chat here. Simple one, do we know, well, is it simple? Do we know approximately how many Africans were living in Tudor England? I did say that there's evidence of about 200, but that's just what's been found so far. And when you're looking at, like I said, a lot of them are parish registers, household accounts where people are being paid wages or being bought clothing, records in letters or diaries, or state documents, voyage accounts, this sort of thing. And that not everybody gets into those records, so there may well have been more, and research continues, but so not a large numbers, but enough to make it interesting, I think. And it's more for me about the quality of those encounters rather than the quantity. Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would agree with you there. It's intriguing once you get to know. Once you get to know one, you get to find out more and more. It grows, but it's tantalizing. It's hard work. It's hard work going through the records. There's a note here. Do we know if they had children, and are there any descendants of these Africans still in Britain today? Well, the short answer is yes. Let me give you two answers. My first answer, I've got to come back to John Blanke. Sorry about this, but Miranda's eyes glaze over. But I'm a big fan. No, but he married. Now we believe he married an English lady. We believe he got married in a local church, and we don't know where he went after that. But it was more than likely that he had children. So John Blanke's genes are still are around today. But having said that, there are specific families we found from the 16th century who are there today. In their we've got the record.
So we do know of one family, the Jetto family.
Yeah, the Jetto.
And this is something that that Marika Sherwood, I think, first found out, and then Onyeka Nubia followed it up as well. And there was this Elizabethan called Anthony Jetto, and he's the first Black Tudor that we know of who actually left a will. And his modern descendants still live in the same county in England. But the thing is, the modern descendant looks like the same color as me. The point is that there may be plenty of white-looking people wandering around England today who have an African ancestor from the Tudor period, because these baptism records and marriage records, are showing children of African ancestry being born in England in the 16th and 17th century. So of course there are descendants of these Africans in Britain today, but they're hard to identify. I said in my earlier draft of my book, I in the conclusion I said I wanted the whole country to do a DNA test. But my editor said that was too controversial and maybe take it out. But I think if we did, we might find more evidence. And I did have an email from somebody in America who had an unusual surname, and it was the same surname as an African that had been baptized in the Bristol area in the Tudor period. So I don't think I'm not sure if we made the full connection, but there's definitely more potential to find those descendants, I think.
Miranda, there's a question here for you. I'll read it to you. With the presence of Sir Francis Drake in the Bay Area, what was the role of the African enslaved people that he obtained from the Spanish and Portuguese? And were they still treated by Drake as slaves?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. Well, the first part of the answer is we don't know a lot about what they were doing. I mean, we know that Diego on the ship was acting as Drake's personal manservant, but he also had very good building skills, partly from his time with the Cimarroons, and he would have been fluent in Spanish from his time in Panama, and have learned enough, also be fluent in English after 4 years in Plymouth. And we know that Drake didn't speak Spanish very well at all. So I think Diego could have been a really useful interpreter for him in that way. And could have helped them build shelters while they were in the area, fixing their ship. And I think there's another really interesting snippet. One of the Portuguese or Spaniards, because quite a few of the Portuguese and Spaniards who Drake captured, he then abandoned again, and they later get interrogated by the Spanish Inquisition, not the Spanish authorities, wanting to know what's going on and figure out where Drake's going next, where they should be protecting themselves from his attacks. And one of them says that Diego, or one of the Africans on board, had made a contract with Francis Drake, which I interpret as that he was being paid wages, like some of the other Black Tudors that we're looking at. And there's also quite a few, like I said, I think there were about 7 or 8 individuals that you can trace that joined the Golden Hind as it traveled up the coast of South America, but most of them were returned. And so there are little snippets saying, they landed someone back somewhere that they would be able to join the Maroons and escape the Spanish again, or they asked to be put back on land, and Drake put them back. Obviously the role of Maria is a lot less it only adds to the negative parts of Drake's modern reputation. Obviously, you mentioned Sir John Hawkins a minute ago, Michael, and of course, Drake was Hawkins's cousin and involved in at least one of his slaving voyages in the 1560s. So I think, I think some of Drake's biographers / hero worshippers have tried to use the Diego story to kind of portray him as this kind of postmodern, non-racist, kind of equal opportunities kind of guy. But I very much see it that Diego was useful to him, and that's why he treated him relatively well. Whereas, well, Maria only had one use on that ship, and then she was abandoned, heavily pregnant, on this island that had no running water. Although one other account says that she and these two men were left there with seeds and things to found a settlement with, but we never hear of them again. So yeah, I can't remember where I got to with this. So yeah, the role of them. So they were treated differently by Drake depending on their usefulness to him, I think. But there is, I think what's quite interesting is that you've got to think this is a mindset where when Diego chooses to join Drake's ship in Nombre de Dios in 1572. In his mind, he will have known that that the English were not enslaving people back in England, because that was common knowledge in the Atlantic world. We've got Spanish officials mentioning it when they're trying to figure out what Drake's going to do next, and there's this massive, fascinating conversation recorded in a Mexican silver mine in the same year, I think in 1572, where there's an English sailor who got dumped on the coast of Mexico after a battle by John Hawkins. And he is in this Mexican silver mine, and he's talking to an African enslaved there called Juan Galof, which means he's probably from the Wolof people in West Africa. And Juan Galof says to this sailor, "Oh, I've heard England is a good place because there are no slaves there." And that's just such a fascinating little snippet. And so I think that's why Diego joins the English, because he thinks he has a hope of freedom if he goes to England. But, unfortunately, everything was going to change within a century. But it's this interesting moment of flux. So I think that might be all the questions we have time for.
That's the end of the questions for now, yeah.
But it's been great to chat, and you can find us online, can't you, Michael? We're out there if you want to hear more from us.
Definitely. I'll go one more time, johnblanke.com.
And you can find my stuff. You just Google Miranda Kaufmann. I'll pop up. There's many more lectures, courses, all sorts of things to learn more about the Black Tudors.